The acquisition of these South Korean tanks is a clear signal. It significantly enhances Poland's defense.
Poland's decision to order 1,000 main battle tanks from South Korea is not only a procurement story. It is a test of how European security is now being manufactured, on timelines measured in months, not decades. This is Troop Talk. Let's begin. The air is sharp with winter. Floodlights cut across a concrete yard at a military rail terminal in eastern Poland. Steel tracks glisten under frost. A low, angular silhouette rolls down a ramp. 55 tons of armor moving with a steadiness that feels almost quiet, until the engine note rises and the suspension flexes over the joints in the metal deck. Mechanics watch for leaks. Soldiers check serial numbers with gloved hands. A new tank has arrived, not from a factory in Bavaria, but from a production line on the far side of Eurasia. A century ago, Poland's security depended on promises, geography, and the hope that distance might slow an aggressor. Today, it depends on throughput. How many systems can be built, shipped, fielded, and sustained before a crisis turns into a front line? The K2 Black Panther, South Korea's premier main battle tank, became the symbol of a deeper shift, away from Europe's traditional defense industrial centers and toward partners that can deliver at speed, with packages designed to be absorbed quickly by a nation that feels the clock running faster than its neighbors. The visible headline was the number 1,000 tanks, so large that it almost reads like a political statement rather than a military plan. But the logic behind it is colder. Poland looked at the war in Ukraine, at its own geography, and at the industrial calendars of its allies. It saw a mismatch between the security environment and the pace at which Europe could rearm. And it decided that the only rational response was to buy time by buying steel fast. The trigger was not abstract. On February 24, 2022, Russian forces crossed into Ukraine. In the weeks that followed, Poland became a logistical rear area for a war that was no longer theoretical. Fuel, ammunition, humanitarian aid, and military equipment moved across its roads and rail lines. Polish planners watched armor battles unfold in real time. Columns ambushed, tanks immobilized by mines, and mechanized units surviving or collapsing based on maintenance, drones, and artillery coordination. The lesson was not that tanks were obsolete. It was that armored mass, properly supported, still decided what could be held and what could be retaken. Then Poland made its own high-risk decision to transfer hundreds of Soviet-era tanks, T-72s and PT-91s, to Ukraine. The strategic intent was clear. Help Ukraine stop Russian armor now, even if it costs Poland numbers in the short term. But the effect at home was immediate. Poland's armored depth thinned. Its legacy fleet was reduced, and the remaining modern tanks, Leopard 2 variants acquired after joining NATO, could not be everywhere at once. In a conventional deterrence model, shortages are manageable because reinforcement is assumed to be slow, deliberate, and collective. On NATO's eastern flank in 2022, shortages were a vulnerability that could be measured in days. Poland's first instinct was European. The Leopard 2 is not simply a tank. It is a system embedded in NATO logistics, European training pipelines, and a decades-long reputation for survivability. Poland already operated Leopards, which meant established maintenance culture and standardized ammunition. In pure doctrinal terms, adding more would have been the cleanest solution. But procurement is rarely doctrinal. It is industrial. And when Poland asked for new Leopard 2s in the early phase of the war, the response it received was not a debate about capability, it was a timeline. German industry had shrunk after the Cold War. Production capacity had become episodic, built around small batches and modernization cycles rather than sustained high output. The Leopard 2 successor program, MGCS, was still a distant prospect, and the newest Leopard 2A8 orders were already stacked for the Bundeswehr and other European customers. For Poland, being told to wait most of a decade for a meaningful number of tanks was not a disappointment. It was a strategic dead end. Deterrence on a border is not a promise to be fulfilled in 2030. It is a posture that has to exist now. South Korea approached the problem differently because it was born from a different threat environment. The K2 was designed by a country that lives under the permanent shadow of conventional war, where the expectation is not that conflict is unlikely, but that it may come with little warning. That mindset shapes factories as much as it shapes doctrine. The K2 program was built around the assumption that production needs to be scalable, supply chains resilient, and deliveries predictable. When Poland entered the market, it found not only a tank, but a production philosophy. On August 26, 2022, Poland signed an executive contract for an initial batch of K2 tanks. The most striking detail was not the price. It was the tempo. Within roughly 16 weeks, the first units were delivered to Poland. In defense procurement, where initial deliveries often arrive years after signature, that timeline carried its own strategic weight. It demonstrated that South Korean industry could treat Poland's urgency as a production priority, not as a polite request to join a queue. Speed, however, is only meaningful when it translates into combat-ready capability. A tank delivered quickly but unsupported becomes a museum piece with tracks. What made the Korean offer structurally different was the completeness of the package. Training, spare parts, ammunition provisions, and a maintenance pathway that could be expanded into local capacity. It was a design not just for purchase but for absorption. And absorption is the hidden limiting factor of every rapid procurement program. Crews need months, not days. Maintainers need tooling, diagnostics, and the ability to cannibalize less. Supply officers need predictable pipelines. If the acquisition is fast but the integration is slow, the strategic gap remains. The K2 itself sits at an intersection of modern tank design priorities: mobility, electronics, and survivability against a battlefield that now includes cheap drones as well as expensive missiles. At around 55 tons, it is significantly lighter than the heaviest Western European designs. That lower weight matters in the geography Poland actually has: rivers, bridges, mixed soil, and an infrastructure network that cannot assume every route can bear a 70-ton platform without engineering support. A lighter tank can be moved more quickly, can cross more bridges, and can sustain higher operational tempo without the same strain on transporters and recovery vehicles. The trade-off is that survivability relies more on layered systems, active protection, sensors, and tactical discipline, rather than pure mass. The K2's power-to-weight ratio is one of its strategic virtues. With a 1,500 horsepower engine, it reaches road speeds around 70 kilometers per hour and maintains high cross-country mobility. But the advantage is not top speed. It is acceleration and sustained movement in broken terrain. Precisely the conditions where mechanized units either keep momentum or become targets for artillery and loitering munitions. The K2's hydropneumatic suspension also gives it unusual agility. The ability to kneel or raise its hull, tilt forward or backward, and stabilize itself for firing positions that would be awkward for a conventional torsion bar layout. This is not theater. It can reduce the exposed silhouette in hull-down positions and improve stability while firing on the move. Firepower is often reduced to caliber, but the decisive details are in the fire control chain. The K2's 120mm smoothbore gun is paired with advanced optics and digital architecture designed for fast target acquisition. Its autoloader allows a 3-person crew, commander, gunner, driver, removing the loader position that defines many Western designs. In theory, this yields a high rate of fire, often cited around 15 rounds per minute in optimal conditions. The trade-off is human endurance and battlefield flexibility. Autoloaders can be mechanically complex, and the loader in a 4-person crew is also an extra observer, a backup for maintenance tasks, and manpower for security when the tank is static. Poland is not simply buying a tank. It is buying a different crew model which changes training, recruitment, and doctrine. By contrast, the Leopard 2, especially the newest A8 variant, embodies a European design lineage shaped by survivability and upgrade continuity. It is heavier, closer to 67 to 70 tons depending on configuration and armor packages. That mass brings an advantage in passive protection, and the Leopard's design ecosystem has proven resilient over decades of modernization. The Leopard 2A8 also integrates systems like active protection, improved sensors, and updated command networks, reflecting the battlefield lessons of Ukraine where top attack threats and drone spotting have changed what armor means. But the Leopard's trade-off is logistical. A heavier vehicle demands more fuel, more recovery capacity, more specialized bridging, and more wear on roads. In a high-tempo eastern flank scenario, The distinction between a tank that is slightly more protected and a tank that can be moved and supported faster becomes strategically meaningful. The procurement question, then, was not which tank is best. It was which tank can be fielded at scale, quickly, and sustained under European conditions. Poland's answer included the K2, but it also included the broader Korean ecosystem. K9 self-propelled howitzers, Fa-50 light combat aircraft, and other systems that together created a rapid modernization ladder. This was not shopping. It was an industrial partnership structured to compress timelines, purchasing now while building domestic capacity for tomorrow. Domestic capacity is where the story becomes less about tanks and more about sovereignty. Nations that cannot produce and sustain complex equipment become dependent not only on allies, but on allies' politics, export approvals, and supply chain priorities. In peacetime, those dependencies are manageable. In crisis, they become bargaining chips. Poland's leadership understood that the central weakness of post-Cold War European defense was not technology, but capacity. Europe could design excellent systems, but it often could not manufacture them quickly enough to change battlefield realities. That is the gap Poland set out to close. This is why the 1,000 tanks headline is only the outer shell. The core is the K2 program, a Polish-tailored variant with local production and deeper maintenance autonomy. On August 1, 2025, Poland signed a second major executive agreement with Hyundai Rotem for another batch of K2 tanks, with an explicit emphasis on localized manufacturing. According to statements released around the signing, a portion of the vehicles will be assembled in Poland at the Rearmament plant in Gliwice, and the industrial partnership includes technology transfer and the build-out of maintenance, repair, and overhaul capacity. The deal's value has been reported around the mid-single-digit billions of dollars, depending on what support vehicles and infrastructure are included, and how the contract is phased. The exact number matters less than the structure. Poland is buying the right to be less dependent. Technology transfer is a phrase that can be either transformative or hollow. It depends on what is actually transferred, not just drawings, but the ability to certify components, to manage quality control, to source subassemblies, and to modify software architectures without waiting for foreign permission. On October 28, 2025, Polish industry and Hyundai Rotem signed a technology transfer agreement focused on the K2, a step that Polish defense firms presented as a breakthrough. It is one thing to assemble a tank from imported kits. It is another to establish an industrial base that can produce, upgrade, and sustain it at scale. For Poland, the difference is measured in wartime resilience, whether spare parts arrive as shipments or as output from local lines. This logic also explains why European alternatives, even when technologically strong, struggled to compete. A German or French procurement model often assumes a slow build, long lead times, and incremental modernization. It is a model designed for predictable budgets and stable threat environments. Poland is planning for the opposite. Unpredictable crises, rapid reinforcement needs, and a border geography that offers little strategic depth. The Korean model fits that reality because it is optimized for mobilization economics, high output in relatively short cycles, backed by a domestic customer that sustains the industrial base even when export orders fluctuate. The systemic layer goes deeper still into how NATO actually generates land power. Tanks are the visible component, but the enabling structure is everything around them. Ammunition production, training ranges, simulator fleets, recovery vehicles, bridging units, fuel distribution, maintenance depots, and the industrial capacity to replace losses or repair battle damage. The war in Ukraine has shown that attrition is not only about destroyed vehicles. It is about vehicles that become non-mission capable because a small component is missing, because a crew is exhausted, because a maintenance backlog grows faster than the supply chain can recover. Poland's modernization program is, at its heart, an attempt to rebuild an integrated heavy force ecosystem with national control over critical nodes. Local production at Gliwice is part of that, but so is the creation of a domestic maintenance culture for the K2 family, and the willingness to fund it at levels that many European countries have avoided for decades. Reuters reporting in mid-2025 cited Poland allocating around the high single-digit percentage of GDP to defense spending, figures that vary depending on methodology, including whether one counts the Armed Forces Support Fund alongside the core defense budget. Even the conservative interpretation signals the same reality. Poland is trying to finance a wartime posture in peacetime that requires not only money, but a procurement system that can translate money into delivered capability without drowning in process. Germany's Leopard 2A8 illustrates the alternative path. On November 19, 2025, KNDS conducted a public rollout event for the Leopard 2A8 and PZH 2000 systems at its Munich site, attended by senior German and Norwegian officials. The symbolism was clear. Germany is rebuilding capacity for new-build armored platforms for the first time in decades. But the schedule remains measured. German orders for 2A8s are planned for delivery across the late 2020s, reflecting a production cadence designed for controlled modernization rather than emergency expansion. The tank is formidable. The problem is time. From Poland's perspective, time is the most expensive commodity. If a gap exists in 2022 or 2023, deliveries beginning in 2027 do not solve it. They simply promise that the gap will eventually close. Poland's wager was that deterrence cannot wait for Europe to relearn how to build at scale. It must be purchased from whoever can deliver now, and then, crucially, replicated at home. This is also why the European solidarity argument, often invoked in defense politics, has limits. Solidarity is a political commitment. Deterrence is a physical one. A tank battalion exists or it does not. Ammunition stockpiles exist or they do not. Repair parts flow or they do not. Poland's decision was controversial not because the K2 is inadequate, but because it signaled a lack of faith in Europe's ability to meet the moment industrially. It was a vote of confidence in Asian supply chains and an implicit critique of Europe's post-1991 demobilization. There are real risks in the Korean path. Integration into NATO logistics is not automatic. Different subsystems create training burdens. Ammunition compatibility must be managed carefully, even within the 120mm standard, because specific round types and fire control programming can differ. Maintenance knowledge takes time to mature, and early operational availability can be undermined by small supply issues if the support ecosystem is not fully established. A tank delivered in 16 weeks can still take months to reach full readiness at unit scale. And a fleet of mixed types, Leopard, Abrams, K2, creates complexity that can become visible under stress. Poland has chosen to accept that complexity because the alternative was vulnerability. The Abrams purchase, announced alongside the K2 pathway, provides a complementary heavy armor core with a proven platform and American support. The K2 offers speed, mobility, and an industrial partnership. The Leopard fleet preserves existing NATO standard capability and institutional familiarity. In theory, this triad offers Poland resilience. If one pipeline slows, others still deliver. The trade-off is logistical burden and training dispersion. But Poland is betting that its geography makes redundancy worth the cost. In the last months of 2025, the pattern of developments has made the underlying logic clearer. On June 9, 2025, Reuters reported that South Korea was nearing a multi-billion-dollar agreement with Poland for additional K2 tanks, emphasizing local production splits between Korean and Polish lines. On July 2, 2025, another Reuters report noted the completion of negotiations and underlined that the second batch would include provisions for local assembly and a deeper industrial footprint. On August 1, 2025, Poland signed the contract publicly, again framing it as both procurement and industrial strategy. Then, on October 28, 2025, the technology transfer agreement for K2PL production was signed, an operational step toward autonomy. And on November 19, 2025, Germany's Leopard 2A8 rollout offered a parallel signal. Europe is reawakening, but on longer timelines. Each date points to the same structural truth. This is not only about what tanks are bought. It is about which industrial systems can respond under pressure. In the near term, over the next 12 to 24 months, the decisive variable will be implementation. Delivery schedules must hold. Training pipelines must expand without diluting quality. Maintenance depots must become genuinely capable, not merely ceremonial. Poland's industrial plan for the K2PL depends on workforce training, supply chain qualification, and the ability to produce components domestically at consistent standards. The stated ambition for meaningful local production late in the decade will require sustained funding and political continuity. Any interruption, economic downturn, domestic political shifts, or supply chain disruptions could slow the maturation of the ecosystem even if tanks continue to arrive from abroad. At the same time, the broader European landscape is changing. Germany's renewed armored production, the push for joint European procurement, and the emergence of new ammunition manufacturing projects across the continent suggest that Europe is trying to rebuild the very capacity Poland went looking for elsewhere. The question is whether it can scale fast enough to close the deterrence gap before it becomes an operational problem. Poland's move has, in effect, forced a stress test. It has shown what speed looks like, and it has made slow timelines politically harder to justify. The K2 program also has implications beyond Poland. If the K2PL becomes a credible European standard variant with local production, it creates an alternative supply chain for other NATO states that want modern armor without waiting until the end of the decade. It also creates industrial competition inside Europe, not only between tank designs but between production philosophies. Limited batch craftsmanship versus high-throughput, export-optimized manufacturing. For European defense, that competition may be uncomfortable, but it is also clarifying. It forces countries to decide whether they value continuity of legacy systems more than the strategic value of speed. In the end, Poland's 1,000-tank order is less a story of preference than of arithmetic. How many platforms can be fielded before an adversary tests the border? How fast can they be repaired? How deep are the magazines? How quickly can losses be replaced? Poland has chosen a path that treats industry as a frontline asset and procurement as a form of strategic engineering. Back at the rail terminal, the new tanks continue to roll off. The sound is mechanical and unromantic. Tracks clattering, diesel engines idling, hydraulic systems breathing. Men and women in cold weather gear guide the vehicles into line, then disappear into the work of making them operational, installing radios, calibrating sites, drilling crews, building the routines that turn a delivered machine into a unit that can fight. On NATO's eastern flank, deterrence is no longer a speech or a treaty clause. It is a production schedule made real in steel.